In the winter of 1989, Elowen Rae Mercer left room 2B at the Hooper Inn in Roswell, in the grip of fierce labor pains and a desert wind that cut to the bone. Hours later, the manager returned to check. Her belongings were untouched. The bed still bore the dent of her body, but Elowen, and the child she carried, had vanished. No scene, no obvious blood, no clue pointing to where she went. Police concluded she fled out of fear of giving birth alone. Her sister's family said she might have sought another place to deliver. Townspeople whispered that she wanted to sever all ties and disappear forever. Then the file went cold for 33 years. No body was ever found. No one confirmed she was alive. No one knew what happened that night. Until the 2010s, when New Mexico's Cold Case Review program reopened the archives. A tiny forgotten placental sample in an old plastic box was analyzed with next-generation DNA technology and instantly overturned every initial assumption. But what shook the case wasn't just the mother's DNA. It was the tissue trail leading to a technical pit that was filled in 1994. It was the infant skeleton buried deep beneath the concrete. And it was the male hair stuck in the soil, belonging to neither Elowen nor anyone in her family. Elias Grant Sutter died 2005, never investigated. Yet his DNA lay right beside the baby's remains. He had never lived at the Hooper Inn. No one ever reported seeing him that night. And Elowen had named the man who showed up as Silas Brannigan, a name not in any records, a man who didn't exist on paper. Someone had been in the darkness that night. Someone carried away the newborn child. Someone knew exactly where the burial spot would be sealed and forgotten. Someone had waited more than 3 decades for their secret to rise from the ground. Before we dive deep into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys to forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. On a December night in 1989, Roswell was wrapped in the dry, biting cold typical of the desert at year's end. Gusts carrying red dust whipped through the row of rundown motel units along Highway 285, where the unstable green neon vacancy sign flickered, casting lighting light on walls scarred with peeling paint. Room 7 in the block was almost always quiet, and that night was no different, until the door suddenly opened, revealing Elowen Rae Mercer, 22 years old, thin, her face pale with pain, hands clutching her belly as it contracted in waves. She wore an old oversized sweater and a thin scarf thrown on in a hurry. She didn't look like someone about to travel far, let alone a woman in labor heading to a hospital. The night manager, busy tidying the front desk, only caught a glimpse of Elowen steadying herself against the doorframe before she stepped down the stairs. He called out awkwardly, asking if she needed a taxi or an ambulance, but Elowen just shook her head. A quick shake, followed immediately by a broken gasp as she fought a stronger contraction. No explanation, no bag, no papers. She turned down the narrow path at the end of the units that led straight into the empty lot behind. That area had long been forgotten. A patch of weeds, scattered sand mounds, and a few leafless trees worn smooth by the wind. City lights barely reached it, leaving a thick darkness broken only when the wind bent the grass aside, and in that darkness, Elowen's figure quickly disappeared. The night passed without incident. No one saw her return to the room. No footsteps, no door opening, no sign of any activity in room 7. A few late-night guests passing through the hallway later said they heard nothing unusual, just the wind whistling through cracks and the sign rattling when the power flickered. Elowen's room remained in the same absolute quiet it had held since the afternoon. Curtains half drawn, the single bulb's yellow glow falling on the few simple things she had brought when she checked in 3 days earlier. The next morning, the day manager made his usual rounds. When he reached room 7, he knocked twice. No answer. He called through the door, thinking she might be sleeping or exhausted. But when noon passed and everything stayed silent, worry crept into his voice. Finally he used the master key and opened the door, only to find everything exactly as it had been the night before. Bag beside the bed, jacket draped on the chair, toothbrush still dry, bed untouched. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. But the occupant was gone without a note. After a moment's hesitation, he flipped through the register and called the family contact Elowen had given at check-in. After just a few sentences, an unnatural silence fell on the other end, the tense silence of people struggling to understand why a woman days from giving birth would leave her room in the middle of the night in such a dangerous condition. The family immediately told him to call the police and report a missing person. At the Roswell Police Department, the duty officer took the missing person call close to midnight. In the empty duty room, fluorescent lights shone down on a desk buried in files and cold coffee cups, while he wrote down every detail. The motel manager provided over the phone, the man's voice shaking and halting, torn between worry and disbelief. A young woman in her final weeks of pregnancy had walked out in obvious pain and hadn't been seen since. That alone made the officer pause and look up at the wall clock. A midnight disappearance was never a good sign, but one while in labor was something else entirely. It screamed life or death risk. Without delay, he entered the information into the system and dispatched a patrol unit to the scene. That was the moment the chain of events linked directly to the previous section. When Elowen's family arrived at the motel, police pulled up too, ready to begin the first official steps of the investigation. From the instant they stepped into the low-aging row of rooms, everything followed procedure, but with far greater urgency than usual, because the initial data showed this disappearance was anything but ordinary. The missing person report was created on site, based on statements from the family, the manager, and the motel's records. The simplest yet most critical details were recorded. Elowen 22, full term, no car of her own, took none of her essentials. Most importantly, the last witness, the night manager, confirmed she left the room in unstable condition, clutching her belly, likely experiencing strong contractions. Police began interviews right there in the motel lobby. Other witnesses were questioned quickly. Did anyone see or hear anything strange that night? Did anyone see Elowen talking to someone? Was there any noise suggesting trouble or that someone followed her? The answers were all the same: no arguments, no cries for help, no noticeable disturbance at all. That only deepened the mystery. A woman about to give birth walked silently into the night and vanished completely, leaving no hint of intent or direction. Based on the manager's consistent account of the direction she took, police pinpointed the last known location, the narrow dirt path leading into the vacant lot behind the motel. The patrol unit shone high-powered lights over the area and began looking for the first signs. Though the desert wind constantly shifted the sand, the ground still held a few faint foot impressions. Some steps were clearer, suggesting the walker was off balance or hurrying. Branches broken at knee height showed someone had recently pushed through the brush. Not far away, police found a small gray scrap of fabric half buried under sand. It was soft and thin, like the edge of a scarf or shirt, possibly torn off during movement. Though inconclusive, it was sealed as the first piece of evidence. As they continued sweeping the path with light, one officer bent down to examine a dark smudge the size of a fingertip on flat rock. Under the strong beam, a reddish-brown color stood out, suspected dried blood. Though the spot was tiny, it was documented and sampled because of its possible connection to Elowen's condition when she left. Another notable discovery was a single slipper lying off to the side beneath a tree. The motel owner immediately recognized it as the kind Elowen wore whenever she came to the lobby. The slipper's presence helped confirm she had entered the vacant lot and likely fell or needed support, judging by the disturbed marks around it. Those small details, when connected, showed this was not a voluntary departure. If Elowen had planned to leave the motel, she would have taken her bag, papers, and especially her baby supplies. Yet everything remained in the room. The irregular footprints, the lost slipper, and the tiny blood spot pointed instead to sudden distress or pain that forced her to stop or change direction. Police documented every trace, photographed everything, and marked off the vacant lot. The tall grass where her figure vanished was cordoned as the priority search zone. The indoor team continued combing the room, Flat bed, dry towels, unused toothbrush, zero sign she prepared for a long absence. Every detail reinforced the same conclusion: Elowen left in an emergency, not by plan. Her family provided additional key information: no conflicts, no prior running away, no stalkers or threats. They insisted she was counting the days until delivery, and had no reason to hide or leave suddenly in the middle of the night. From all data collected in the first hours, police agreed the risk to both mother and unborn child was high. The search and investigation were elevated in priority, and expanded that same night. Those scattered signs became the foundation for the more detailed scene survey the next morning, when the official investigation took a deeper turn. When the search teams returned to the vacant lot at first light the next day, picking up directly from the scattered traces recorded overnight, daylight quickly revealed the area was far more complex than flashlight beams could show. The faint impressions, broken branches, and single slipper marked the night before became guideposts as they widened the search radius. And right where those traces overlapped most heavily, the investigation suddenly opened a completely new direction. One of the first forensic officers crouched at the center of the tall, disturbed grass. From a distance it looked like ground torn up by animals, but it was too round and too deep to be natural. When the layer of red dust was brushed aside, dark brown streaks appeared, not large but fanning out in an arc. The technician only needed 1 second before signaling everyone to freeze. They immediately cordoned the area. This wasn't a scrape or accidental blood spatter. The wide fanning pattern mixed with drag marks showed blood had flowed during a prolonged event, not instantly. A few steps away were deeper compressed patches, almost shallow pits. An officer noted these were consistent with someone kneeling, sitting, or bracing hands on the ground long enough to deform the surface. In multiple spots, light but continuous drag marks appeared, suggesting to investigators the image of someone desperately shifting position in intense pain. Police divided into teams and worked outward in circles, checking every clump of weeds. When one investigator pushed right and parted the brush, he nearly froze. Beneath layers of dry leaves lay a patch of soft brownish-red tissue, part of it caked with dirt but still clearly structured. The forensic tech approached, examined it for seconds, then looked up with a completely changed expression. It was placental tissue. No more doubt, no other possible explanation. No chance this was just panic or a simple fall. Elowen had given birth right here. A flurry of orders went out almost simultaneously. Expand the perimeter, photograph everything from above, mark every blood trail, every impression, every foreign object. The presence of the placenta, irrefutable proof delivery had occurred, elevated the entire scene to an emergency obstetric crime scene. That meant every surrounding trace might now hold clues not just about the mother's movements, but about the newborn. During the wider sweep, a technician found streaks of dried fluid on rock. In the slanting morning sun, their color was unmistakably that of lochia or amniotic fluid. This solidified the timeline. Elowen had entered active labor before reaching the lot and delivered during the night. But the real horror came from what was missing. No infant, no sign the baby had ever been left at the scene. No blanket, no small fluid traces from the baby, no tiny footprints, no infant-related items. The area bore only traces of the mother. Nothing indicated the child's presence after birth. That instantly shifted the investigation. No longer a missing pregnant woman, but a double disappearance in which a newborn vanished immediately after delivery. A specialized child crimes unit was called in urgently. They had experience with abandoned, abducted, or post-birth deceased infants, and they knew a newborn's survival time, in freezing desert night conditions, was almost zero. The baby could not have left on its own. Only two possibilities: the infant died before leaving the area, or someone took it. The lead investigator cross-referenced the scene with overnight findings. The lone slipper, small blood spot, drag marks on the ground. Put together, They showed the event had not been silent as first thought. Elowen may have struggled alone in pain, or someone else had been present without leaving clear traces yet. Giving birth outdoors at night, in freezing wind, with no assistance, almost guaranteed complications, severe blood loss and postpartum shock. Another corner of the scene showed lightly disturbed soil, as if someone had knelt or sat, but the shape didn't match Elowen's impressions. Police flagged it as the second suspicious point. Not conclusive yet, but the first hint a third person might have been there. As blood and fluid samples were collected and sealed, the on-scene lead investigator entered the preliminary conclusion into the file. Events at the scene indicate subject Elowen Rae Mercer gave birth in the vacant lot behind the motel. Infant not located at scene. Case reclassified to infant missing after delivery. From the moment that note hit the system, the entire context of the case changed. It was no longer about one woman disappearing in the night. It was about two lives, one mother exhausted after birth, and an extremely vulnerable newborn, vanishing from the same spot, in the same narrow window of time, with no trace of which direction they went. The official investigation took on a new nature, determining exactly what happened immediately after the child was born, and why no one saw or heard anything from a birth scene that took place only a few dozen yards from the motel. The initial findings at the birth scene forced the investigation team to immediately shift direction. They were no longer just looking for Elowen, but had to determine what happened right after she gave birth, and why both she and the baby had vanished completely from the abandoned lot. As the forensics team packed up the last samples and gathered under the rising sun, the lead investigator ordered everyone to pause all expansion activities and move to the next step, building the first hypotheses based on what they actually had in hand. No single direction was strong enough to lead to a conclusion, but all were plausible given the physical evidence. The first hypothesis put on the table was that Elowen had left the scene on her own with the child. This was the most natural line of reasoning since there were no clear traces of an infant remaining behind. Debate erupted immediately within the team. A medical examiner pointed out that the odds of a woman who had just given birth under such brutal conditions being able to stand up, pick up the baby and walk a significant distance were extremely low. Blood loss, postpartum shock, pain and physical weakness made movement almost impossible. Still, the team could not completely rule it out. In cases of extreme panic or overwhelming maternal instinct, a new mother can sometimes push her body beyond normal limits. A few drag marks and chaotic footprints around the edge of the scene could indicate Elowen had tried to stand or had moved in desperation. At the same time, the total absence of smaller footprints, pieces of cloth used to wrap the baby, or any sign the infant had been carried away, made this hypothesis fragile. There was simply no evidence the baby had left the scene with Elowen. The second hypothesis, which the investigators considered more viable, was the presence of a third party at the scene after the birth. A wider, deeper depression in the ground near the edge of the tall grass that did not match the size of Elowen's footprints led police to suspect someone else had stood or knelt there. Flattened grass pointing east also did not match the direction of Elowen's movement according to witnesses. If someone else had indeed appeared, the possibilities expanded dramatically. That person could have helped, taken mother and child away, or been an accidental witness. But there was also the chance the individual was directly responsible for their disappearance. The major obstacle with this line of inquiry, however, was the complete lack of witnesses. No one saw a stranger entering or leaving the area behind the motel that night. No one heard noises, no one saw unfamiliar vehicles parked nearby. The lot had too many access points, meaning anyone could have approached without leaving obvious traces. The third-party hypothesis was therefore retained at a high probability level, but its exact nature, witness, intervener, or perpetrator remained undetermined. The third hypothesis was raised with the greatest caution: the newborn may have died shortly after birth and been hidden. The cold night, dry ground, and harsh environment created a very high risk of postpartum death without medical help. Given the amount of blood and amniotic fluid at the scene, the baby might not have survived, but the biggest question was if the infant died, where was the body? The team scoured the surrounding soil for signs of burial or disturbance, but nowhere showed evidence of digging or tampering. This made the hypothesis shaky. If the baby had been buried, there would be clear traces. If not buried, who took the child, and why? None of the scenarios fully answered those questions. With the three hypotheses on the table, the team went back to re-screening witness statements and environmental factors. The motel manager was questioned a second time to confirm exactly when Elowen left her room. Guests in rooms 6 and 8 were re-interviewed to see if they had heard groaning, struggling, or a baby crying that night. Every answer was the same: they heard nothing. The investigators could not ignore this, yet they also could not rely entirely on the statements because night wind and the open space might have masked all sounds from the birth scene. Environmental factors offered no help in narrowing the direction either. Strong wind could have erased secondary footprints or blown away crucial evidence. Tall grass and sandy soil made movement traces faint and hard to distinguish. There were no security cameras at the time, no lighting, no witnesses, no passing traffic. All of it made accurately reconstructing the first hours after the birth nearly impossible. When all collected data was compiled, the lead investigator wrote the final assessment for this phase. All three hypotheses remained possible, but none had enough evidence to become the official lead. The investigation temporarily entered a waiting for additional evidence state, hoping that one new detail, no matter how small, might separate the right path from the dead ends. This phase of the case ended in uncertainty, but the team understood clearly that they had only seen the surface of a far more complicated story. Immediately after the three hypotheses were formed, but none carried enough weight to set a primary direction, the team quickly shifted to a more urgent and independent line. The medical track. From every conclusion at the scene, one thing was certain: a newborn had been delivered under extremely dangerous conditions, and the fact that the baby was not at the scene forced police to check whether any medical facility had admitted mother or child. This was the only step that could answer the most critical question at that moment: had Elowen or the baby been taken to a hospital after the birth? The sweep began that same morning, when the investigator in charge of the county's health system immediately called the area's largest hospital, Eastern New Mexico Medical Center. Night shift nurses were asked about any reports involving a woman in labor, an unusual delivery, or a newborn brought in for emergency care. Every answer was the same: no one named Elowen Mercer, no young woman matching the description, and most importantly, no newborns admitted throughout the night or morning. Not stopping at one hospital, police compiled a list of every medical facility within an 80-kilometer radius of Roswell, from hospitals, OB/GYN clinics, and private practices to community health centers. In 1989, records were not digitized, so checking had to be done facility by facility, document by document, shift by shift. 2 teams of officers traveled by patrol car to each location to cross-check admission logs, duty rosters, and delivery reports for the previous 24 hours. At Vaughn Community Clinic, more than 50 kilometers away, an older nurse flipped through the night's handwritten notes and shook her head. No deliveries, no obstetric emergencies, no newborns. At a private clinic near Dexter, the doctor on duty said they hadn't had a single patient all night. Smaller facilities in Hondo and Hagerman yielded the same results: no sign of mother or infant being admitted. At every location, police asked the same questions: did anyone call asking for advice about a delivery? Was there an ambulance call that got cut off? Did anyone come looking for medication or emergency medical supplies? The answers everywhere were blank. Even when they reached the Carlsbad Health Station nearly 120 kilometers from Roswell, officers recorded nothing unusual. One of the nurses remembered the night clearly because only 2 staff were on duty, and every emergency call was logged by hand. The night had been completely quiet. The medical track conclusion grew clearer: no hospital or clinic within a reasonable travel radius had admitted Elowen or the newborn in the 12 hours after the birth. To be thorough, the lead investigator ordered checks at even the least likely places: veterinary clinics, general private practices, and mobile care units run by churches or nonprofits. All denied any connection. Not only were there no direct admissions, police also reviewed ambulance records. EMS units in Roswell and surrounding counties were required to produce call logs, incident hotlines, and public phone recordings, because sometimes a panicked woman might call for help without explaining the situation clearly. The ambulance logs for that night showed no dispatches related to a woman in labor. Once the entire list of possible medical support locations was exhausted, the team realized something that made the atmosphere heavier. There was no indication the baby had ever received care from any medical facility after birth. This left two possibilities, both grim. The child had never been taken to a hospital, meaning it could have been in immediate danger after delivery. Or someone had deliberately avoided all contact with medical facilities, meaning intervention or concealment. The medical track investigator gave a brief report of the full results back to the forensics team at the scene. At the same time, the Missing Children Unit of the New Mexico State Police was notified. A newborn delivered without medical care, missing outdoors in cold weather, with no record of reaching any hospital. This pushed the case to high emergency status under internal guidelines. Elowen's family was informed as soon as the medical sweep concluded. The news devastated them, though they didn't want to think the worst. The results meant the baby was in extreme danger, or might not even survive if left exposed. Police entered the entire medical track results into the case file. A short but heavy conclusion was added to the report. No medical facility recorded a delivery or newborn during the relevant time frame. Male infant highly likely never received medical care. Situation high emergency level. The cold numbers and blank spaces in hospital ledgers confirmed one thing: the baby had never appeared in any medical system, meaning the case was no longer just a missing persons investigation, but a race against time to find a life in danger with every passing hour. Right after the medical track confirmed that no hospital or clinic had admitted Elowen or the newborn, the team had to return to the community to search for indirect signs. This is the noisiest phase of any missing persons case, and sure enough, within hours the tip line began receiving a flood of calls from people claiming they had seen someone who looked like Elowen or heard a baby crying at dawn. The first lead came from a truck driver who said he saw a woman walking along Highway 285 at first light. Though the description was vague, the team still had to verify it. When they checked miles of that road, they found no physical evidence or signs anyone had stopped. When the driver was pressed, he wasn't sure the woman he saw was pregnant or could even confirm it was Elowen. The tip was discarded. Soon after, a family on the outskirts reported hearing prolonged baby crying during the night. The report caught attention because it directly involved a newborn, but when officers arrived, they quickly discovered the family lived near a goat farm, the source of many previous false reports. When played a recording of goats, the family admitted the sounds were nearly indistinguishable. No signs of strangers around the property. Another lead eliminated. Another witness claimed to have seen a man carrying something that looked like a baby get into a pickup truck. Police traced the license plate and discovered it was just a delivery worker carrying a puppy he had just bought. Nearby store security footage confirmed it. The report was crossed off. A middle-aged woman living near the motel said she heard very faint cries for help around midnight, but she was a known frequent caller who often mistook natural sounds. When re-interviewed, no neighbors heard anything unusual. No signs of disturbance. Tip discarded again. Another report came from a man who insisted he saw Elowen at a gas station early in the morning. However, the station's rare working camera showed no woman resembling Elowen during the time he described. The man also failed to recognize her in photos shown by police. One more dead end. Within 24 hours, dozens of tips came in, and every one was ruled out due to lack of physical evidence, lack of corroborating witnesses, or confusion with people, sounds, or pets in the area. This slowed the investigation considerably. Though the odds of any tip being accurate were low, The team could not ignore a single one. Overlooking just one real lead could send the entire case in a completely different direction. The investigators built a large timeline board, marking each report, location, and reason for elimination. From an overall view, the tips came from scattered locations with no overlap in time or place, and most importantly, no pattern suggesting Elowen or the newborn had actually appeared in any of those areas. Each report was an isolated dot with no trail or connection. When the day's report was compiled, the lead investigator wrote clearly, "No leads confirmed." All reports led to dead ends. Investigation temporarily stalled. Though that summary was brief, it accurately reflected the case at that moment. The team was chasing shadows while nothing solid enough existed to expand or narrow the search. This was the point where the investigation began to be overwhelmed by uncertainty, and police started to feel the case sliding closer to a full impasse. When every lead from the community had been exhausted one by one, and the medical investigation turned up no glimmer of hope, the team was forced to confront the outcome they had prayed would never happen. The case was grinding to a halt. Every source of information from the scene, witnesses, the hospital, and tips from the public had been wrung dry, yet nothing new surfaced. And the utter silence that followed in the days afterward became the most terrifying part. It suggested that both Elowen and the child had simply dissolved into the night without a trace. The stagnation became unmistakable starting on the third day, when the team had planned to widen the search to fields and gullies farther from the motel area. Expanding the search, however, required at least one guiding piece of data, a faint trail, or a point of suspicion to justify the manpower. Every prior theory, Elowen left with the baby, a third party was involved, or the infant died after birth, had failed to produce anything further that could support widening the net. The lead investigator had no choice but to file an interim report acknowledging the severe lack of evidence. In it he noted, "No sign Elowen left the scene in any direction, no object proving the newborn ever left, no witness who heard a baby cry, and no related medical records." In other words, mother and child had vanished completely right after the birth on that abandoned lot. The team clung to the tiniest traces for a few more days, but the effort yielded nothing. Windblown sand had blurred footprints, the dried blood was too scant for further testing. The scrap of fabric contained no clues tied to an infant, and the frigid night had erased any chance of finding heat signatures or lingering body traces in the wasteland. Local police conducted sweeping resident checks, but no one matched the description of a possible third party, and no one reported taking in an illegally adopted newborn. No unusual statements, no sudden departures from the area in the days after. Checks of trucks, warehouses, and abandoned properties turned up nothing. Every line of inquiry, no matter how promising, dead-ended at the same blind spot. By the second week, with every effort circling back to zero, the Roswell Police Department began scaling back manpower on the case. Some investigators were reassigned to other pending files. Newer Roswell-related reports kept pulling resources elsewhere. The remaining team still monitored the case, but the pace slowed, and attention on Elowen's disappearance faded with time. Elowen's family kept calling the police, hoping for any update. The answers they got grew vaguer. "We're still searching. No new information yet. We'll contact you if anything comes up." Those well-meaning responses couldn't hide the truth. The case was stalling out. By month's end, the lead investigator submitted the final report of the active investigation phase. It stated plainly that neither the mother's body, the newborn's body, nor any clear sign they were alive or dead, had been recovered. There was no evidence of foul play, yet nothing to rule it out either. No new leads, no basis to reopen any old ones. With that, the Roswell Police Department officially classified the case as a cold case. The file was coded NM89 Baby Boy, reflecting the year and nature of the incident, a newborn gone missing right after birth in New Mexico in 1989. All physical evidence from the scene was carefully sealed: the gray cloth fragment, blood samples, soil samples, Elowen's sandals, and photos of the disturbed grass. Though they couldn't yet tell the full story, They were preserved in the hope that one day new technology or evidence would unlock them. The file grew thicker yet moved no further forward. The case was frozen, not because police gave up, but because they had nothing left to grasp. And from that point on, the disappearance of Elowen Rae Mercer and her nameless baby boy, on a winter night in Roswell, became one of the quietest mysteries of 1989. A mystery no one knew would take decades for the truth to finally start cracking. 2 decades had passed since file NM89 baby boy was moved to the cold case archives, and in all that time not a single new lead had surfaced regarding Elowen Rae Mercer and her newborn. The evidence collected at the scene sat untouched in the Roswell Police Department's storage, sealed inside old plastic boxes. The case had become one of the least mentioned files, not because it was solved, but because it left almost nothing to follow. That changed in the early 2010s, when the state of New Mexico launched a program to re-examine long-dormant cold cases, focusing on those with intact biological evidence. That initiative dragged NM89 baby boy back into the light after more than 20 years of oblivion. Among the investigators tasked with reviewing old files was a newer face, Detective Avery Calder, recently transferred from crime scene analysis. Younger than most of his colleagues, Calder tended to dig into details others overlooked, and was especially excited about modern forensic methods, techniques that didn't exist in 1989. When he opened the NM89 baby boy box, the first thing that struck him wasn't the lengthy reports, but how abruptly the investigation had ended at the dead-end section. No charges, no suspect, no new leads, just a short closing line, no further evidence. Case suspended. Calder read the entire file cover to cover over several hours, then set the reports aside and focused on the evidence. The old sandals, the gray cloth fragment, the few vials of blood, all had been examined only with traditional methods. One item made him pause longer, the placental tissue sealed in its own container. According to the 1989 records, it had only been histologically confirmed, never subjected to DNA analysis, because back then genetic testing was primitive and couldn't produce strong enough data. Calder realized this was where modern technology could change everything. In the 2010s, genetic genealogy was becoming a powerful new tool for solving unidentified person cases and decades-old cold cases. If the DNA in the placenta was still viable, it could open the door to the child's biological family, or the mother's, something no one in 1989 had even considered. He immediately checked the seal. Storage conditions were outdated, but still acceptable. Temperature stable, container intact, and records showed the sample had never been reopened since initial archiving. Ideal conditions for modern DNA testing. Calder took his proposal to the cold case review team meeting. He explained that the placental tissue could be analyzed using next-generation sequencing, and then run through genetic genealogy services, like Parabon nanolabs. The technology could do far more than confirm sex, or basic kinship. It could locate distant relatives, rebuild family trees, and lead investigators to the mother or related family members. If the mother could be identified, police could trace whether Elowen was still alive, where she was, and what happened to the baby. Some of the older detectives were skeptical. To them the case was too old, the biological evidence possibly degraded, and no one knew if the mother was even alive. Calder pointed out that many recent cold cases solved by genetic genealogy had once been labeled too old to test. This was no longer a question of possibility, but of willingness to try. After much discussion, the proposal was approved. The placental sample would be sent to Parabon nanolabs, the nation's leading genetic genealogy lab, which had already helped crack numerous cold cases across the country. The process would take time, but if successful, it could deliver data the 1989 team never had a chance to see. Before resealing the evidence for transport, Calder stood alone in the quiet storage room, staring at the small box that had held the forgotten tissue for decades. He knew one thing for certain: if any hope remained of learning the truth about Elowen Mercer and that nameless child, It was right there, in tissue that had been silent for over 20 years, but now had a chance to speak thanks to leaps in forensic science. Case NM89 Baby Boy was officially reactivated, opening a new chapter after more than 20 years buried in silence. And with modern DNA technology leading the way, a story that once seemed forever unsolvable began moving again. As soon as the placental tissue was resealed and shipped to Parabon Nanolabs, Detective Avery Calder tracked the progress almost daily. The lab reported that the sample still contained enough material for full DNA extraction, a rare piece of good news for evidence over 20 years old. Next-generation sequencing made it possible to reconstruct the genome of the newborn, who vanished in 1989, something the previous generation of investigators could never have imagined. The first phase, extraction, repair of time-damaged fragments, and genome reassembly, took several weeks. Parabon's analysts pieced together the tiny segments, identified surviving genetic markers, and used algorithms to produce a complete DNA profile for infant Doe. Once the data was clear enough, they moved to the next step, uploading it to expanded genealogy databases. One early autumn morning, Calder received the first email from Parabon. It contained just one short sentence: "We have located maternal relatives." He called immediately, and the hour-long conversation revealed information that could redirect the entire investigation. According to the DNA matches, the infant's genome showed close genetic links to a cluster of families scattered across New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. The degree of similarity indicated these were not distant cousins. Many individuals in the system were likely second- or third-degree relatives. Parabon began building the family tree backward, tracing branches using public records, genealogy data, birth and death certificates, and civil documents. Over the following days, the surname Mercer kept appearing in interim reports. One Mercer branch in New Mexico matched the infant's DNA especially closely. Parabon dug deeper: women of childbearing age in 1989, geographic ties to Roswell, and any recorded activity from that period. Gradually, the name Elowen Rae Mercer emerged as the only plausible candidate for the child's biological mother. A few days later, Calder received the official confirmation report. Parabon's conclusion was unequivocal: the placental DNA matched the Mercer family tree at 99.98%, and every line of analysis pointed to the same inescapable fact. The mother of infant Doe was Elowen Rae Mercer, the woman who had mysteriously vanished on a winter night in 1989. Though the finding essentially confirmed what the 1989 file had long suspected, it created a major shift in the investigation. The crucial part was not just identifying the mother, but the next question: where had Elowen been for the past 2+ decades, and was she still alive? If she was alive, she was the last witness who knew what happened to her newborn. If she was not, the investigation had to uncover why her story ended tragically. Either way, the next task was clear: find any remaining trace of Elowen to clarify the fate of infant Doe. Calder called a meeting with New Mexico's cold case unit. He presented Parabon's full results, stressing that the case was no longer just a missing infant, but the disappearance of a mother and child under suspicious circumstances. He emphasized that every subsequent step would revolve around reconstructing Elowen's movements, that fateful night, and chasing any surviving records connected to the Mercer family. The veteran detectives sat quietly in the conference room. They remembered the desperate searches in the dark of early 1989, the reports that ended with the word "dead end." Now, after more than 20 years, a major piece had finally fallen into place: the identity of the mystery newborn. The DNA results didn't immediately answer what happened the night of the birth, or where the baby boy went. But they opened a path forward. Finding Elowen meant finding the truth. Calder left the meeting knowing the case had turned a new page. With the Mercer family tree now mapped at its center, he finally had a starting point. And for the first time in over 2 decades, investigation NM89 Baby Boy was no longer standing still. The moment the genetic genealogy results confirmed Elowen Rae Mercer as the biological mother of infant Doe, investigator Avery Calder knew the next step could not rely solely on the 1989 files. To move forward, they had to locate Elowen, determine her current condition, and find out whether she could provide a statement that would shed light on the baby's fate. The urgency spiked when Parabon confirmed Elowen was still alive in civil records, news that instantly shifted the entire cold case team into hunt mode. Calder teamed up with veteran investigator Rowan Maddox, who had extensive experience running federal-level surveillance operations. The two combed through civil data, rental agreements, public medical records, and tax filings. Everything pointed to the same address, a quiet residential complex in Amarillo, Texas, where a woman listed as E.R. Hanlon rented a small apartment. The surname change raised red flags, but the date of birth and several demographic details matched Elowen Rae Mercer perfectly. A surveillance plan was drawn up within the week. Maddox and Calder flew to Amarillo carrying an old description of Elowen, though both knew that after more than 20 years, people change. Yet when they saw the woman step out of apartment 2B on the first morning of the stakeout, no further confirmation was needed. The gait, the distinctive pale eyes, even the faint freckles across her cheeks were still visible. It was Elowen, older, quieter, and seemingly still avoiding all social contact. Over multiple days of surveillance, Elowen lived a solitary life, long shifts at a food packing plant, home in the evenings, almost no interaction with neighbors, no signs of substance abuse, violence, or any threatening behavior. That only deepened Maddox's curiosity. A woman living so discreetly and breaking no laws, yet she had changed her identity for 2 decades. Most importantly, what exactly happened the night she gave birth on that vacant lot in 1989? To open a formal investigation, they needed DNA confirmation. Direct contact was impossible without stronger legal grounds, so they resorted to the now familiar indirect method used in countless cold cases. Maddox suggested monitoring the complex's trash. The law allows collection of discarded items once they leave the owner's private space. 3 days later, the opportunity arrived when Elowen cleaned her apartment over the weekend. She carried out a large black trash bag to the collection point. Maddox watched from a distance and waited for the garbage truck to leave the area. At a pre-arranged stop, coordinated with the local waste management department, Maddox and Calder discreetly retrieved the bag and transferred it to a temporary lab in Amarillo. There they searched for anything that might contain biological traces, paper cups, tissues, feminine hygiene products, an old toothbrush. They finally recovered a hairbrush with a substantial number of strands. The sample was sealed, rushed to the New Mexico lab, and marked top priority. 4 days later, the lab sent Calder an urgent notification. He immediately got the forensic technician on the line. The results were near absolute. The hair from the Texas apartment matched 100% with the maternal genetic source in infant Doe's genome. It not only confirmed the mother-child relationship, but reinforced Parabon's genealogy conclusions and eliminated any possibility of error. Calder printed the report and took it to the briefing room where Maddox was waiting. When he placed the DNA results on the table, Maddox simply nodded. They had fully confirmed the identity of the woman who vanished in 1989. Elowen was not only alive, she was the central piece of the entire case. But if Elowen was alive, and had not raised the child, the biggest question became even heavier. Where did the baby boy go? Who took him? And why had Elowen never reported anything in over 20 years? There was no doubt left. The investigation had to move to direct confrontation with Elowen Rae Mercer, the only person alive who knew the truth of that winter night in 1989. Once the indirect DNA results confirmed Elowen Rae Mercer as infant Doe's biological mother, the team had no reason to delay. The perfect genetic match, combined with her original 1989 missing person report, was enough for the New Mexico prosecutor's office to issue an arrest warrant for investigative purposes. It was not a charging warrant, but a necessary material witness hold to prevent flight risk, especially given her prior name change and interstate movement. A quick planning meeting was held in Amarillo. Maddox and Calder coordinated with Texas police to ensure the arrest was safe, low profile, and did not alarm the small neighborhood where Elowen lived. From days of observation, mornings were when she left earliest for work, usually carrying a purse and 2 lunch containers. They decided to execute the warrant the moment she locked her door and stepped off the porch, when she was least alert and foot traffic was minimal. That morning, the Texas sky was gray and the wind biting. Elowen opened the door of 2B, pulled her coat tighter around her neck, and walked down the wooden steps. She clutched her keys, apparently checking a work schedule on a small slip of paper. Maddox approached from the front, Calder blocked the right escape route, and 2 Texas officers covered the rear. "Elowen Rae Mercer," Maddox asked clearly, not loud, but enough to stop her in her tracks. Elowen froze. The first thing that flashed across her eyes was not panic but deep confusion, as if that name no longer belonged to her. She swallowed hard, and stood motionless. "You are under arrest on authority of the state of New Mexico," Maddox continued, "in connection with a 1989 missing person investigation." In that instant her whole body seemed to go limp. The lunch containers slipped from her hand, and cracked softly against the steps. She raised a hand to her mouth, breathing fast, but she did not run, did not resist, did not ask questions. She simply stood there, eyes fixed on the ground, as if she had always known this moment would come. Just not after more than 20 years. Calder gently cuffed her, avoiding sudden movements. He noticed small details. She wasn't shaking much, but she actively avoided eye contact. Rapid pulse, shallow breaths, signs of psychological shock rather than defiance. As she was guided into the back seat of the patrol car, she spoke one soft sentence, barely audible, "I don't know what to say." A neighbor in 3A cracked her door open to peek, but Texas officers immediately asked her to step back inside and keep the area calm. No one in the complex knew what was happening, and no one realized the quiet woman who had lived there for years was carrying a 2-decade-old secret. In the car, Calder watched Elowen through the rearview mirror. She sat straight, hands in her lap, cuffs glinting. No tears, no explanations, just the look of someone who had been tired for so long that hiding was no longer worth the effort. As the car headed to the Amarillo station for transfer paperwork to New Mexico authorities, Maddox spoke quietly to Calder. "She didn't fight, didn't act uncooperative, but she's not the type to spill everything right away either." Calder nodded. He knew that after more than 20 years of evasion, Elowen's silence was not simple fear. It signaled a complicated story, possibly guilt, possibly victimhood, possibly something else entirely. As soon as the transfer was complete, Elowen would be transported back to New Mexico for formal interrogation. Everything was now building toward the case's most critical moment, a direct confrontation with the only living person who knew the truth about that winter night in 1989. Whatever answer she carried could collapse every previous theory, or finally bring the investigation closer to the ultimate truth than ever before. Immediately after arriving back in New Mexico, Elowen Rae Mercer was taken to an interview room at the Chaves County Sheriff's Office. The first interrogation was conducted by investigators Rowan Maddox and Avery Calder, the same 2 who had followed the case since reactivation. Elowen was given water and seated at a cold metal table, no longer cuffed, but her tension had not eased. The harsh white lights made her face look even paler. Maddox began with soft questions: why she moved to Texas, her current life, whether she knew the 1989 missing person case had never been fully closed. Elowen answered sparingly, but without resistance. She insisted she had no idea, police still had an active file, and certainly did not know genetic genealogy could find her after all these years. Then the interview went to the heart of the matter. "Where did you give birth on the night of December 17, 1989? Elowen was silent for a long time before answering, "Out on the vacant lot behind the motel. I didn't have time to call anyone." Calder followed up, "And the baby?" That was when her expression changed. She didn't cry or tremble, but something like an emotional wall went up between her and the two investigators. It didn't survive. She spoke softly, almost in a whisper. When he came out, he didn't cry. He didn't move. I panicked. I thought he was already gone. Maddox wrote down every word, then gently continued. What did you do with the baby's body? Elowen lightly bit her lower lip and avoided their eyes. I left. I don't remember where I left him. It was so cold that night. I thought, there was nothing more I could do. Calder exchanged a glance with Maddox, knowing this statement, though it sounded like an attempt at explanation, did not match either the 1989 autopsy report or the new forensic evidence. Based on the placenta and blood volume, experts had determined the infant was full term with no indicators of stillbirth or immediate postnatal death, and crucially, there was no evidence Elowen remained at the scene long enough to confirm the baby's actual condition. Calder placed the old autopsy report on the table and opened it to the relevant page. Elowen, medical analysis shows the baby was full term, no signs of stillbirth, no evidence he died immediately after delivery. Elowen just stared at the tabletop. Her reaction was neither anger nor denial, more like the fear of being cornered. Maddox continued, calm but pointed, you say the baby didn't survive. Forensic data says the opposite. Do you want to revise your statement? Elowen clasped her hands tightly, knuckles white. She appeared to be fighting between continuing the evasion and finally saying something she had kept buried for over 2 decades. At last she let out a long, slow breath and said, I didn't take the baby away. The interview room seemed to freeze for a beat. Calder leaned back, eyes sharpening. Then who did? Elowen hesitated for a very long time. Her shoulders trembled slightly, not from cold, but from memories rising to the surface. Silas Brannigan. The man's name came out like an old wound reopening. Both Maddox and Calder went silent for several seconds. That name appeared in none of the 1989 records. No witness had ever mentioned him. There was no trace that Elowen had ever been connected to anyone named Silas. Calder pressed immediately. Who is he? Someone you knew. A motel guest. Someone who picked you up that night. Elowen shook her head, voice small and choked. Not someone I really knew. I had seen him a few times at the motel. We barely spoke. But that night, when I had the baby, he showed up. I don't know why he was there. He said he would help. Maddox leaned forward. Help with what? Elowen closed her eyes, visibly holding herself together. He picked the baby up. I still thought the baby was gone. But I wasn't sure. I was so exhausted. I just wanted to sleep. And he said he would take care of it. I wasn't awake enough to stop him. Calder asked quickly. Where did he take the baby? What did he do with him? Elowen didn't answer right away. It took nearly half a minute before she said, I don't know. When I woke up, he was gone. The baby was too. A heavy silence blanketed the room. This statement, vague as it was, opened an entirely new investigative direction. It not only contradicted the original assumption that Elowen left with the child, but introduced the presence of a previously unknown individual, Silas Brannigan, a man who was never on the 1989 radar, a man who was there at the exact moment Elowen gave birth, a man who claimed he would take care of the newborn, yet left no trace. Calder wrote the name in large, clear letters, knowing that from this moment the case NM89 baby boy had entered a new phase. Find Silas Brannigan and discover what he did with the infant 20 years ago. Elowen's statement about Silas Brannigan's sudden appearance weighed the interrogation room down like lead, and the moment she finished with I don't know where he took the baby, Maddox instantly knew the investigation had to return to the 1989 crime scene with an entirely new perspective. They could no longer rely solely on the fragmented memory of an exhausted postpartum woman from more than 20 years ago. The team had to reconstruct the complete movement paths of both Elowen and Silas immediately after the birth. Calder pulled every 1989 scene file onto the table for review, cross-checking against the latest statement. The plot behind the Hooper Inn, where the placenta and disturbed soil were found, had once been twice its current size, stretching all the way to the rocky lot in the north. Evidence from that year was sparse, but geologists confirmed it was still possible to match movement patterns by analyzing deep soil layers. A forensic survey team was redeployed to the old lot. They drilled 3 deep cores, compared soil compaction levels, and cross-referenced the 1989 gravity distribution diagram stored in the city's construction archives. Though footprints were long gone, the subsurface soil retained elongated deformation patterns heading north, typical when someone carries a light but bulky object, exactly like cradling a newborn. That match shifted the team's focus to the one escape route never thoroughly searched in 1989, the narrow dirt track leading from the wasteland to the abandoned north parking lot. Back then, police had concentrated east and west, the more obvious flight directions. But if Silas moved quietly to avoid detection, north was the most discreet choice. Calder contacted the city's GIS department for old topographic maps, USGS satellite imagery, and every land development report from the late 1980s to early 1990s. Once the data was loaded into 3D modeling software, one anomaly stood out. The north lot had contained an engineering pit dug in fall 1989 and backfilled in 1994 ahead of warehouse construction. The location aligned perfectly with where the soil compression model showed movement abruptly ending. Maddox stared at the map and drew a large circle around the former depression. If Silas carried the child that way, this is where he had reason to stop. To bolster the conclusion, the soil analysis team compared sediment samples from the northern area with soil still clinging to the cloth fragment recovered in 1989. Mineral structure, clay to fine sand ratio, everything matched exactly. This proved Elowen and Silas had moved toward the parking lot, not any other direction. Another question arose: how deep was that 1989 engineering pit? The Public Works Archive supplied the old blueprints, approximately 1.8 meters deep, enough to conceal a small object without drawing attention. The timing of the backfill also coincided with the area's expansion for the warehouse, permanently sealing whatever lay beneath. Calder and Maddox reviewed the simulation together. The route began at the birth site, followed the compressed soil trench, curved into the parking lot, and ended precisely at the now-filled pit. When every piece statement, soil analysis, topography, historical records was combined, an inescapable conclusion formed. Silas Brannigan's final stop that night most likely lay beneath the concrete floor of the current warehouse. Maddox prepared the application for an excavation warrant. This was not just a technical step, it was the pivotal move that could overturn the entire case. As the request went out, the team stood before the large wall map, the simulated route glowing as a clear white line. From the wasteland where Elowen collapsed, along the quiet dirt track, to the abandoned parking lot, where every trace ended, they had pinpointed the place they needed to search. All that remained was to break through that layer of earth, and see what silence of more than 20 years had been hiding. The excavation warrant was signed late afternoon, and by the next morning, the entire Old North warehouse sector of Roswell was sealed off. Warehouse staff were told to cease operations. The forensic team erected tents, set up high-powered lights, and established a security perimeter. Calder and Maddox were on site from the start, armed with the terrain simulation map and the exact coordinates of the former engineering pit beneath the concrete. Industrial saws were brought in to cut the slab into 1-meter squares. The work was slow and deliberate. Each section was marked, photographed, then lifted by small crane to avoid disturbing the soil beneath. The surface was dry and cold, but slightly deeper appeared a dark, moist clay layer, proof the area had indeed been excavated and refilled as recorded in 1994. At the 6th square, a forensic technician shouted, "Soil structure change here." Calder rushed over. The subsurface showed unnatural mounds and dips, with soil and sand distribution typical of a hand-filled hole. The team switched to smaller tools, trowels, soft brushes, probes, to preserve evidence. Minutes later a clump of soil broke away, revealing an ivory-white object, deep in the clay. No one spoke. A technician gently brushed the surface, and the tiny curve of an infant skull emerged. The air inside the tent seemed to freeze. Calder knelt, recording calmly. The skull shape matched a full-term newborn, bones intact but discolored by 2 decades of mineralization. There was no longer any doubt. They had located the remains of infant Doe. As the rest of the skeleton was carefully exposed, technicians noted specific details: bone length consistent with a newborn, no traces of cloth wrapping, bone arrangement indicating the body was placed, not thrown, no heavy overlying objects, meaning the pit was filled gently. To the right of the remains, technicians recovered a small gray cloth fragment, partially decomposed, but fibers still identifiable. The weave pattern matched the fabric of the dress Elowen wore in 1989, previously labeled source unknown in the old files. This was the first physical link confirming the infant had been removed from the birth scene and placed here. Then, while excavating the pit edge, a technician whispered excitedly, "Hair, a very fine strand over 4 centimeters long, dark brown, stuck to the damp soil. It did not belong to the infant, and did not match any of Elowen's indirect DNA samples." Under a handheld magnifier, the cuticle was intact, no violent shearing, consistent with long-term stable burial. Calder sealed the strand in an evidence vial, labeled, "Unidentified male hair." Color and structure strongly suggested adult male, matching Elowen's description of Silas Brannigan. If DNA extraction succeeded, this could be the first direct link tying Silas to the burial site. Once the complete skeleton was recovered, technicians placed each bone on stainless trays, noting exact position and surrounding conditions. Though time had taken its toll, the remains were sufficient to confirm the child had never gone far, not with Elowen, not lost, not taken to any medical facility. The baby had been placed in that pit on that winter night, and left beneath the cold earth for 24 years. Maddox stood silently at the edge of the hole. "It all comes back here," he said quietly. "Not an accident, deliberate." Calder looked at the tiny skeleton one last time before the team sealed it in a preservation bag. "And now we have something to prove it." When the final concrete slab was replaced, and the pit covered, the investigators left the site carrying the case's most critical evidence: the remains of infant Doe, the cloth fragment matching the birth scene, and the male hair, potentially carrying the key that pointed straight to Silas Brannigan. A new chapter began, identifying the perpetrator and discovering why the child was brought here. The male hair recovered from the burial site was rushed to the state lab at highest priority. It was the first evidence not belonging to Elowen or the infant, and offered a possible direct bridge to the man Elowen knew as Silas Brannigan. Yet when technicians began extracting DNA from the shaft, the initial results pulled the investigation in an entirely different direction. The hair's DNA profile was run against state, federal, and genealogy databases. Within 48 hours, a technician called Calder voice, equal parts excited and cautious. "We have a match, but it's a name you've never heard." The sample matched 99.97% to Elias Grant Sutter, born 1954, died 2005 in Colorado. Initial records showed Elias was a freelance mechanic who drifted through New Mexico in the 1980s, 90s before settling in Colorado, where he died of pulmonary complications. Calder flipped through the file, checking repeatedly. Not a single 1989 missing person document mentioned Elias Sutter. No witness reported seeing him at the Hooper Inn. No record of investigation or contact with Elowen. Elias's DNA beside the infant remains raised one huge question: was Elias actually Silas Brannigan, or were they two completely different men? The investigation pivoted to tracing Elias's footprint. Civil record analysts found one noteworthy detail. In 1989, Elias worked short-term contracts repairing generators and machinery for motels, small construction sites, and temporary lots. Notes from a former employer stated he took jobs around Roswell that winter, exactly when Elowen gave birth. Digging deeper, however, everything grew murky. No record of Elias staying at the Hooper Inn. No work contract, medical record, neighbor statement, or motel owner confirmation. Elias Sutter's life in late 1989 was essentially a blank, making him a ghost in the files, rather than a clear suspect. Meanwhile, forensic experts focused on determining the infant's cause of death. Detailed bone analysis revealed no trauma, no direct violence. Mineralization patterns and jaw development confirmed full-term birth and likely survival immediately after delivery. Micro-indicators in the ribs and long bones showed characteristic markers of death by severe cold exposure, consistent with Roswell's winter night temperatures in 1989, meaning the baby did not die in utero or during birth. It died from being left in the cold. This forensic finding deepened the contradiction in Elowen's statement. If the infant was alive after delivery, why did she believe it was dead? And if she did not carry the baby away, what role did Elias Sutter play in taking or abandoning it? Calder presented the findings to the review board. Elias Grant Sutter was definitely present at the burial site, he said. But he died in 2005, we can't question him. And Elowen insists the man she met was named Silas Brannigan, not Elias. Maddox leaned back, silent for a moment, then concluded, "We have a long-dead man whose DNA matches the evidence. We have a different name in the statement. One of two things is true. Either Silas was Elias, or a second person was involved, and we've only found traces of one of them." The case was not closed. It expanded. Elias Sutter was added as a person of critical interest, yet his role witness, intervener, or accomplice, remained lost in the fog of years. And once forensics concluded the infant died of exposure, the team understood the actions of the man who appeared the night Elowen gave birth were no longer random. They were the turning point, and possibly the key to the true nature of Silas Brannigan, who until now had remained completely invisible. Elowen's statement about Silas Brannigan's sudden appearance weighed the interrogation room down like lead, and the moment she finished with "I don't know where he took the baby," Maddox instantly knew the investigation had to return to the 1989 crime scene with an entirely new perspective. They could no longer rely solely on the fragmented memory of an exhausted postpartum woman from more than 20 years ago. The team had to reconstruct the complete movement paths of both Elowen and Silas immediately after the birth. Calder pulled every 1989 scene file onto the table for review, cross-checking against the latest statement. The plot behind the Hooper Inn, where the placenta and disturbed soil were found, had once been twice its current size, stretching all the way to the rocky lot in the north. Evidence from that year was sparse, but geologists confirmed it was still possible to match movement patterns by analyzing deep soil layers. A forensic survey team was redeployed to the old lot. They drilled 3 deep cores, compared soil compaction levels, and cross-referenced the 1989 gravity distribution diagram stored in the city's construction archives. Though footprints were long gone, the subsurface soil retained elongated deformation patterns heading north, typical when someone carries a light but bulky object, exactly like cradling a newborn. That match shifted the team's focus to the one escape route never thoroughly searched in 1989, the narrow dirt track leading from the wasteland to the abandoned north parking lot. Back then, police had concentrated east and west, the more obvious flight directions. But if Silas moved quietly to avoid detection, north was the most discreet choice. Calder contacted the city's GIS department for old topographic maps, USGS satellite imagery, and every land development report from the late 1980s to early 1990s. Once the data was loaded into 3D modeling software, one anomaly stood out. The north lot had contained an engineering pit dug in fall 1989, and backfilled in 1994 ahead of warehouse construction. The location aligned perfectly with where the soil compression model showed movement abruptly ending. Maddox stared at the map and drew a large circle around the former depression. If Silas carried the child that way, this is where he had reason to stop. To bolster the conclusion, the soil analysis team compared sediment samples from the northern area with soil still clinging to the cloth fragment recovered in 1989. Mineral structure, clay to fine sand ratio, everything matched exactly. This proved Elowen and Silas had moved toward the parking lot, not any other direction. Another question arose: how deep was that 1989 engineering pit? The Public Works Archive supplied the old blueprints, approximately 1.8 meters deep, enough to conceal a small object without drawing attention. The timing of the backfill also coincided with the area's expansion for the warehouse, permanently sealing whatever lay beneath. Calder and Maddox reviewed the simulation together. The route began at the berth site, followed the compressed soil trench, curved into the parking lot, and ended precisely at the now-filled pit. When every piece statement, soil analysis, topography, historical records was combined, an inescapable conclusion formed. Silas Brannigan's final stop that night most likely lay beneath the concrete floor of the current warehouse. Maddox prepared the application for an excavation warrant. This was not just a technical step, it was the pivotal move that could overturn the entire case. As the request went out, the team stood before the large wall map, the simulated route glowing as a clear white line. From the wasteland where Elowen collapsed, along the quiet dirt track, to the abandoned parking lot, where every trace ended, they had pinpointed the place they needed to search. All that remained was to break through that layer of earth, and see what silence of more than 20 years had been hiding. The excavation warrant was signed late afternoon, and by the next morning, the entire Old North warehouse sector of Roswell was sealed off. Warehouse staff were told to cease operations, the forensic team erected tents, set up high-powered lights, and established a security perimeter. Calder and Maddox were on site from the start, armed with the terrain simulation map and the exact coordinates of the former engineering pit beneath the concrete. Industrial saws were brought in to cut the slab into 1-meter squares. The work was slow and deliberate. Each section was marked, photographed, then lifted by small crane to avoid disturbing the soil beneath. The surface was dry and cold, but slightly deeper appeared a dark, moist clay layer, proof the area had indeed been excavated and refilled as recorded in 1994. At the 6th square, a forensic technician shouted, "Soil structure change here." Calder rushed over. The subsurface showed unnatural mounds and dips, with soil and sand distribution typical of a hand-filled hole. The team switched to smaller tools, trowels, soft brushes, probes, to preserve evidence. Minutes later, a clump of soil broke away, revealing an ivory-white object deep in the clay. No one spoke. A technician gently brushed the surface, and the tiny curve of an infant skull emerged. The air inside the tent seemed to freeze. Calder knelt, recording calmly. The skull shape matched a full-term newborn, bones intact but discolored by 2 decades of mineralization. There was no longer any doubt. They had located the remains of infant Doe. As the rest of the skeleton was carefully exposed, technicians noted specific details: bone length consistent with a newborn, no traces of cloth wrapping, bone arrangement indicating the body was placed, not thrown, no heavy overlying objects, meaning the pit was filled gently. To the right of the remains, technicians recovered a small gray cloth fragment, partially decomposed, but fibers still identifiable. The weave pattern matched the fabric of the dress Elowen wore in 1989. Previously labeled source unknown in the old files. This was the first physical link confirming the infant had been removed from the birth scene and placed here. Then, while excavating the pit edge, a technician whispered excitedly, "Hair, a very fine strand over 4 centimeters long, dark brown, stuck to the damp soil. It did not belong to the infant, and did not match any of Elowen's indirect DNA samples." Under a handheld magnifier, the cuticle was intact, no violent shearing, consistent with long-term stable burial. Calder sealed the strand in an evidence vial, labeled, "Unidentified male hair." Color and structure strongly suggested adult male, matching Elowen's description of Silas Brannigan. If DNA extraction succeeded, this could be the first direct link tying Silas to the burial site. Once the complete skeleton was recovered, technicians placed each bone on stainless trays, noting exact position and surrounding conditions. Though time had taken its toll, the remains were sufficient to confirm the child had never gone far, not with Elowen, Not lost, not taken to any medical facility. The baby had been placed in that pit on that winter night, and left beneath the cold earth for 24 years. Maddox stood silently at the edge of the hole. "It all comes back here," he said quietly. "Not an accident, deliberate." Calder looked at the tiny skeleton one last time before the team sealed it in a preservation bag. "And now we have something to prove it." When the final concrete slab was replaced, and the pit covered, the investigators left the site carrying the case's most critical evidence, the remains of infant Doe, the cloth fragment, matching the birth scene, and the male hair, potentially carrying the key that pointed straight to Silas Brannigan. A new chapter began, identifying the perpetrator, and discovering why the child was brought here. The male hair recovered from the burial site was rushed to the state lab at highest priority. It was the first evidence not belonging to Elowen or the infant, and offered a possible direct bridge to the man Elowen knew as Silas Brannigan. Yet when technicians began extracting DNA from the shaft, the initial results pulled the investigation in an entirely different direction. The hair's DNA profile was run against state, federal, and genealogy databases. Within 48 hours, a technician called Calder voice, equal parts excited and cautious. "We have a match, but it's a name you've never heard." The sample matched 99.97% to Elias Grant Sutter, born 1954, died 2005 in Colorado. Initial records showed Elias was a freelance mechanic who drifted through New Mexico in the 1980s before settling in Colorado, where he died of pulmonary complications. Calder flipped through the file, checking repeatedly. Not a single 1989 missing person document mentioned Elias Sutter. No witness reported seeing him at the Hooper Inn. No record of investigation or contact with Elowen. Elias's DNA beside the infant remains raised one huge question: was Elias actually Silas Brannigan, or were they two completely different men? The investigation pivoted to tracing Elias's footprint. Civil record analysts found one noteworthy detail. In 1989, Elias worked short-term contracts repairing generators and machinery for motels, small construction sites, and temporary lots. Notes from a former employer stated he took jobs around Roswell that winter, exactly when Elowen gave birth. Digging deeper, however, everything grew murky. No record of Elias staying at the Hooper Inn. No work contract, medical record, neighbor statement, or motel owner confirmation. Elias Sutter's life in late 1989 was essentially a blank, making him a ghost in the files, rather than a clear suspect. Meanwhile, forensic experts focused on determining the infant's cause of death. Detailed bone analysis revealed no trauma, no direct violence. Mineralization patterns and jaw development confirmed full-term birth and likely survival immediately after delivery. Micro-indicators in the ribs and long bones showed characteristic markers of death by severe cold exposure, consistent with Roswell's winter night temperatures in 1989, meaning the baby did not die in utero or during birth. It died from being left in the cold. This forensic finding deepened the contradiction in Elowen's statement. If the infant was alive after delivery, why did she believe it was dead? And if she did not carry the baby away, what role did Elias Sutter play in taking or abandoning it? Calder presented the findings to the review board. "Elias Grant Sutter was definitely present at the burial site," he said. "But he died in 2005, we can't question him. And Elowen insists the man she met was named Silas Brannigan, not Elias." Maddox leaned back, silent for a moment, then concluded, "We have a long-dead man whose DNA matches the evidence. We have a different name in the statement. One of two things is true: either Silas was Elias, or a second person was involved, and we've only found traces of one of them." The case was not closed. It expanded. Elias Sutter was added as a person of critical interest, yet his role, witness, intervener, or accomplice, remained lost in the fog of years. And once forensics concluded the infant died of exposure, The team understood the actions of the men who appeared the night Elowen gave birth were no longer random. They were the turning point, and possibly the key to the true nature of Silas Brannigan, who until now had remained completely invisible.